Kathleen Carroll, Executive Editor and Senior Vice President of the Associated Press, will open our program this morning by setting a framework for our discussion about secrecy and its challenges to the free flow of information. Kathleen has sweeping responsibilities for content from AP journalists based in more than 240 bureaus in 97 countries, and she leads the deliberations leading to discussions about security issues for journalists covering stories in war zones and other hostile environments. She drives AP's commitment to public service journalism that begins with newsroom enterprise and is supported by a legal team at the ready with challenges when access is denied. She has led AP's aggressive efforts through Freedom of Information filings to unseal documents, open proceedings, and fight newsroom subpoenas. In 2009, AP's legal team participated in nearly 90 media access cases, some on its own and some with other news-gathering organizations. Last year, AP was involved in some 70 federal FOIA cases involving 24 agencies, including requests, administrative appeals, and ongoing negotiations. Kathleen Carroll has helped shape a new sophistication and depth in AP coverage. She is credited with leading the transition of the wire service into the multimedia formats necessary to be competitive and useful in today's digital world. She was a reporter at the Dallas Morning News before joining the AP in 1978. Over the next 6 years, she was a writer and editor in 4 AP bureaus. In 1984, she went to Paris as business editor at the International Herald Tribune, returning to the United States as an editor at the San Jose Mercury News. Kathleen rejoined the AP in 1990 as a news editor in Washington, specializing in domestic policy coverage. In 1996, she moved to Knight Ridder, where she was named Washington Bureau Chief in 1999, and she was named Executive Editor of the AP in 2002. Please welcome Kathleen Carroll.
Thank you, Bob. And at the risk of being an editor in a room full of editors, I was only one of several business editors at the Herald Tribune. I would hate for anybody to get the wrong impression. Well, good morning, and thank you very much for having me. I'm quite excited to be part of this discussion. And I'd like to start, if I may, with a notion that is, for me, really a universal truth. And it is this. Government officials the world over, whether they preside over a tiny hamlet or a sprawling nation, whether they came to power by ballot or bullet or heredity, they all have one thing in common. They have this moment where this single thought crystallizes for them. I'm in office, and you're not, and what I'm doing is none of your damn business. Of course, there are leaders that serve, the people that the leaders serve have a different idea. They want access to the information that tells them what those governments are doing on their behalf, for them, or in some cases to them. To be sure, there are public officials who genuinely believe in transparent public work, and there are members of the public who can't be bothered about what their government is doing. But the broad strokes are true, and they create ongoing tensions around these questions. I'm going to add questions to yours, Barry. What should be secret and what should not? And more important, who decides that? Today, around the world, governments decide what you should know about what they're doing. Excuse me. The temptation to keep things from the public is very strong. President Obama acknowledged that in a memo on administering the Freedom of Information Act issued just as he took office. It says, quote, "The government should not keep information confidential merely because public officials might be embarrassed by disclosure, or because errors or failures might be revealed, or because of speculative or abstract facts." That sounds pretty good, right? Yeah. But making that stick in real life turns out to be a challenge. Obama's own Department of Homeland Security was a notorious laggard in responding to legal requests for information, not just from journalists, but from average citizens and from members of Congress. The requests were vetted through a political lens. Top Homeland Security officials asked whether the requester was a citizen or a journalist, where they lived, who they worked for, what was their political affiliation. In less than 2 years, the department generated more than 1,000 pages of documents simply detailing their vetting process of people who asked them questions under the law. The secretive practice was changed only after we began asking about it, raising hell about it, and as our story was about to hit the wire. But 2 journalists and an attorney had spent months knocking on dozens of doors, demanding interviews, threatening legal action, simply trying to get information that is legally open from an administration that declares that this is the law of the land. Imagine how much time and energy it takes to get information from governments that have no laws spelling out what belongs to the public. Now, this is not a new issue. In 1985, the Greenpeace ship Rainbow Warrior was blown up in the harbor of Auckland, New Zealand, as it prepared to protest nuclear testing in the French territories of the South Pacific. It was a pretty amazing thing, a civilian boat blown up in the harbor. A photographer on the boat was killed, and suspicion quickly turned to the French government. It vigorously denied involvement. It pointed the finger to lots of other people that it thought were behind this bombing. And then the newspaper Le Monde began breaking story after story on the government's involvement, while the government's curtain of denials and lies began to shred. Ministers resigned, and 2 French agents were convicted. 2 decades later, the head of the intelligence service at the time confirmed to Le Monde that it was actually President François Mitterrand who personally ordered the attack on the boat. Was that the only secret of the Mitterrand era? Not by a long shot. Among other things, the president hid his cancer diagnosis from the people for more than 15 years while he was in office. They only learned that he had cancer when it killed him a few months after he left the presidency. He also had a long extramarital relationship that produced a child. Now, plenty of people would argue that that was a personal matter. Perhaps. But then why were the mechanics of the state used to keep that secret? In 1993, a very feisty tabloid in France called Libération revealed that a special presidential unit had been wiretapping politicians and journalists, in particular those who might know about the relationship with the woman and the child. What was that unit supposed to be doing? Going after terrorists. Claiming secrecy is required to protect national security is a well-worn rationale for keeping information private. And sometimes it's true. Governments do have legitimate secrets, and exposing them really can put some people at risk. The issue is that governments too often stretch that national security rationale well beyond reason. It's hard to see the risks in some of the classified material that my colleague Matt Apuzzo wrote about last week. Did you know that the United States and Canada are friendly with each other and are likely to remain so? Did you know that Brazil is a strong democracy and often a U.S. ally on foreign policy issues? Did you know that in England, the Liberal Democratic leader, Nick Clegg, and the Conservative leader, David Cameron, don't get along? And, as any British newspaper reader could tell you, they sometimes have referred to each other by silly names. Wow! What blockbusters! All of those documents are classified under U.S. rules that allow anybody with a red stamp that says classified to stamp those documents. Last year, the United States spent $9 billion with a B dollars keeping that kind of information secret. It's actually a lot more than $9 billion, actually, because that figure doesn't include what the U.S. spends on classifying material from intelligence gathering agencies like the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency. What they spend to keep classifying documents out of the public view, that figure is classified. The United States is far from being alone in the none of your beeswax club. Here are just a few things that governments have done in wrapping that opaque cloak around what should be public and what should not. The rationales include: you're violating our national security, you're being disrespectful of our nation, that's one of my favorites, or you're trying to damage our image. Forgive me, I forgot the part of my job that said upholding your image was my responsibility. So, a nation's leader is giving a speech, and as he leaves the stage, he trips. Video of that trip is transmitted, and the ministers in that country go ballistic. Many months of wrangling with them to keep them from throwing us out of the country ensued. A soldier fainted at a military review. Photographers who took and distributed pictures of the soldier slumping over were treated to a threatening meeting with the commanding officer of the military, where bloodshed was inferred. Thousands of people gather on the streets to support an opposition candidate in one country. Foreign reporters are kicked out. Local reporters are banned from covering the opposition events, and those who manage to do so are summoned to ominous meetings, threatened with midnight phone calls, and in some cases beaten or jailed. It's an all too familiar sad story in too many countries, as many of you know. A close cousin of keeping secrets is asserting control, and governments have done that in a variety of ways down through the years and still to this day. Visas, calling local reporters in, spouses of reporters losing their jobs, all in an effort to keep control of information. So, we live in this modern era of technology. Doesn't technology help the world become more open? Yes and no. Technology can help move information around quickly, and it can put original source material in front of a wider audience, and it may someday soon help us more easily unearth and understand what's in those documents. I know some of you, Jonathan Stray among you, are working on just such projects. And technology has certainly given hundreds of millions of people their own place to publish, and that's pretty thrilling. But precious few of them are using any of those tools to dig out what governments are doing. And I mean on a large scale or a small scale. It turns out that reporting is hard. It's sometimes boring and repetitive. Sometimes people are mean to you and they won't give you what you ask for and they tell you to go away. So the increasingly lonely task of ferreting out secrets continues to fall primarily to journalists, like many of the organizations represented here, and to a few hardy folks who are applying good journalistic principles to their own self-publishing. Bob alluded to it a little bit in his opening remarks, but just to show you just how hard this can be, in the United States, which has laws that dictate what can be public, AP journalists last year filed more than 1,500 state and federal FOIA requests just seeking information for stories. And we're on track to file another 1,500 this year. These are not requests, this is not FOIA for give me all your dirty secrets. Most of the time this is pretty ordinary information, like last year when a flock of birds hit a plane and the plane ended up landing in the Hudson River. We asked the government how many times this happens. That's a secret, they said. It took several news organizations, including the AP, several months to finally get the answer. Threatened lawsuits and hundreds of dollars in legal bills. These fights aren't new, but they are becoming more expensive and more protracted. You've got to have the stomach for a fight every day. And if you're going to win, you have to know the law and all the possible loopholes, backdoors, and escape hatches. And you have to be ready to appeal when you are denied what you believe to be yours to have. This is not a whine from a media company. We're fortunate. We have a lot of reporters, and we're able to train them, and they're editors on the law, and we have a whole bevy of great attorneys. So imagine the barrier if you're an average citizen who simply wants to ask the government some questions. Now, there's been a bit of cheery chatter lately that whistleblowers no longer need the stodgy old mainstream media. They can go directly to the public with their findings. Well, God bless them. How do they draw an audience? Social networks, links, blogger references? Really? How does that loose distribution network distinguish between a whistleblower who's got good stuff from the cacophony of, well, all the other self-proclaimed whistleblowers? I don't know about you, but my inbox and my mailbox are filled every day with stories of outrage, wrongdoing, and cussedness that need investigating if only someone else will take up the cause. There may indeed be some speculative scandals uncovered every day on the web. Who the hell knows? Who could find it? How are you going to know? And how is a genuine whistleblower supposed to pierce through all of that noise? Let's talk about the sheer practicality of what they have to do. Simply plopping a stash of electronic documents into the public domain does little to enlighten people. It's kind of like taking somebody, now this is generational reference here, taking somebody to that big warehouse where Charles Foster Kane's goods were all stored in big crates stacked up to the ceiling, and throwing open the door and saying to them, "Okay, go find Rosebud." Besides, posting material online makes a whistleblower really vulnerable to bosses or investigative agencies that may want to come after them. And they do. News organizations have provided the audience and the additional work required that puts context around what the whistleblowers have to say. And they've provided a modicum of protection to whistleblowers over the years by protecting their sources, by protecting their identity, and protecting those who took the risk to reveal a secret or unmask a problem. They have been a kind of buffer. The net, so far, has been unable to provide that buffer. Of course, not all documents are newsworthy, and not all secrets are found in documents. Sometimes you can uncover secrets in plain sight. You can even count them. One of the biggest recent questions in Mideast peace negotiations has been around how many settlements are being built in the West Bank after Israel lifted a moratorium on building there. People knew, but nobody was talking. So a longtime correspondent in the area, Karen Laub, decided to just count them. And so she spent 2 days in a car, fending off angry security guards, and went and counted and found that an astonishing 544 homes had been started in just 3 weeks, a rate of construction that was 4 times what had ever been seen before. Why does that matter? Well, it absolutely is a critical point in the endless saga that is the Middle East peace process. We no longer call it a negotiation, it's its own process. No one was trying to cover up the construction. They just didn't see any need to brag about it. In Pakistan, the country has been ripped by terrorist attacks many, many times, and the authorities always vow to bring the attackers to justice. But they're not doing so well about it. Pakistan has yet to convict a single person in any of the 20 largest terrorist attacks in the last year. That was not a number in a file somewhere. That was not a piece of information that some minister was hanging on to until we persuaded him to cough it up. Reporter Sebastian Abbott and several of his colleagues spent 6 weeks tracking down the individual court cases, talking with prosecutors and judges, and just doing the grunt boot work that allowed them to say, despite all the news conferences, the promises that things are going to happen, nothing has happened. Elsewhere in Indonesia, a reporter started counting and concluded that 1 of every 4 terrorism suspects that has been captured in that country by the U.S. trained forces is killed. So, here we are, 2010, about to be 2011, talking about secrets. It's so not a new topic, but the fact that we're still talking about it indicates that the problems have yet to be sufficiently attacked. And it's true that eventually some secrets finally do come to light. For her book, Enemies of the People, journalist Kati Martin went back to her native Hungary in search of the secret police archives that might explain why her parents, both journalists, were imprisoned by the communists in the 50s and 60s. The very existence of a secret police archive is remarkable in itself. There's a building in Budapest where you can go and look at all of the secret police files. Can you imagine such a thing? There were meticulous records, and they were never destroyed, even as the Cold War ended. Now it's become kind of an act of healing to throw open the files so that people can see how their friends, neighbors, and the society spied on each other. It's hard to imagine, if you didn't live through that, what this era of secrets and files and the intrigue of spycraft in Vienna and divided Berlin was like. So much that seemed so vital to hide then is now available to anyone who makes their way to this building in Budapest. Kati, for her part, discovered the names of everybody who spied on her parents, what led to their imprisonment, and she also learned some family secrets that, maybe her parents would not have wanted her to know. It makes you wonder, in the years to come, where else might there be an archive of the top secret, the secret, or the just plain classified? Will the generations who come after us be shocked to read the now unclassified notes that declare Canada and the United States to be the best of friends? Who knows? Thank you very much for your time. Look forward to seeing the rest of the program. Yeah. I have, yes, we can. I was mindful of Stephanie, the time minder here.
Anybody? Any questions?
What was the hardest piece of information at AP? What was the piece of information that took longest for AP to prize out?
Oh, gosh. That's a really good question. What was the longest duration? Hardest and longest are probably two different things. Longest, I think there are probably some documents on really spinachy things that were 3 or 4 years in the making. So, once you got them, you wondered what the fuss was all about. The hardest things are less about prying things out. They have to do more with protecting people in the field who are doing what we take for granted here in the United States. People in about 100 different countries, some of whom use every tool available to them to keep folks from showing up and reporting on, street protests. That's the hardest for me. And to be honest, the hardest thing for me is always, and for all of us, not just for me, for all of us, is the number of people who work for us who get their heads bashed and their jaws smacked and who are beaten up for just ordinary journalistic work. That's always hard. And that's a tool of secrecy, It's a tool of control.
Since WikiLeaks started to release information,
Yep.
have your journalists found it harder to get the government or to get people to open up? No. I think that we understand that will change things, that governments, not only the United States, but elsewhere, will be trying to plug whatever leak they think they can, and that they'll come up with new methods to lock things down. I mean, if Canada and the U.S. being BFF is considered a secret now, I don't know where that blanket will be extended. But no, it's probably too short a time. Governments work slowly, and this is a fairly intricate process, but I do think we'll be seeing it cited as reasons for secrecy in many years to come. Yeah.
You mentioned that one of the advantages or one of the situations that the press can offer to whistleblowers is that protection of sources, offering a buffer for them.
Right.
And then you observed that the net has not been able to provide that buffer. Do you see any reasons in the future why that buffer wouldn't exist through digital transmission of secrets?
No. I mean, I don't think it's an impossible task. I just don't think it's happened yet. And, technology makes it easy to hide, and technology also makes it easy to find.
You mean to find the person who is
yes,
through IP addresses,
yes,
et cetera,
yeah,
et cetera.
Absolutely. But it's not clear to me yet what role the non-traditional press or future iterations of that can provide in terms of agreeing to take the material, vetting it on their own, and then standing up to the authorities who come in search of the person who provided it. That all takes a lot of resource and time and energy and will, and it can be pretty damned intimidating. And it's not something that you can take on your own, I don't think. I'd like to be wrong, but so far, no.
Do you think that the creation of WikiLeaks in and of itself represents a distrust of the mainstream media? Why didn't they take it to the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the AP?
I don't know. But I think, you'd have to ask the person who released the information what their motives were, and everybody thinks they know who that is, and if that's true, he's not available at the moment to ask. I think there's a certain anarchy in going around mainstream media, and I always say that with affection since I think the AP is about as mainstream media as you can get. As I said, I cheer the efforts of people who aren't in traditional journalistic organizations to also ferret out information. I don't think this is, wouldn't ever lay claim to this being only something that journalists should do. But if there was distrust of the mainstream media in getting that information out, WikiLeaks had to turn to the mainstream media to actually do the work around it that gave it value. We reported, the editor of Le Monde and others told us that WikiLeaks was posting only the material that Le Monde, The Guardian, the New York Times, Der Spiegel, and El País had vetted and sent back to them. WikiLeaks had not, until then, just posted everything they had. So even WikiLeaks understood the value of the reporting process on the information. So even if the motivation was, there was a recognition that there's value to that additional work.
Well, I think that WikiLeaks submitted or attempted to the State Department to identify people so they wouldn't be harmed, and the State Department declined.
I will tell you what kind of at the risk of being accused of being a shill for the State Department, that request kind of came in late, and it was the equivalent of when you've been working on a story for 2 weeks and at 4 o'clock on the day before publication you call the person for comment. You can say that you called them, but it wasn't much of an effort. And are you presuming in the question that the State Department has the right, has an obligation to work with WikiLeaks on this? That's not their view, but...
No, I think that
Can we get to other questions, please?
Okay.
Do you still use local reporters to tell local stories that might have wider implication?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but we do have local. The AP staff is made up of people who are natives of the country that they cover and of people who are from somewhere else.
Because in the South in the 60s, these local stringers were blocking stories from coming out of the South, and they had national implications. Is this still going on?
It's a pretty big, sweeping statement. I mean, I think you put reporters in locations that will get the news out because that's the job, in whatever way you can.
Can you talk a little bit about the AP's approach to, AP was not one of the organizations that was selected by WikiLeaks, and yet, you have to cover the story somehow.
Sure.
How much independent reporting do you do? How much attributing to others? But what was your general approach to how your reporting was going to happen as it unfolded?
Yeah, it's a good question. We were not one of the recipient organizations, but everybody in the pool That's our view. And, we picked up and attributed work that was done by others, as we do on all kinds of things, because that's the right thing to do. And we also knew that we had audiences for that material that some of those organizations didn't, so we were looking at it ourselves. We had reporters all over the world looking at it and finding things that were going to be of interest to the readers in their parts of the world. We had Africa stories and Germany stories and Italy stories and Canada stories, I don't have a lot of patience with the old journalistic tradition that if somebody beats you to a story, you just piss all over it. If it's a good story, get in and drive it.
Can I just call on you, Simon?
Yeah, it's a related question to that, which is, could the Associated Press have got into a relationship with WikiLeaks in the same way that the New York Times and the Guardian did? And could you talk a bit about the editorial process you'd have had to go through?
Sure, we could have. We were prepared to. We were. And would have. We would not have made some of the deals that WikiLeaks was proffering, seeking a control over where the documents were stored and who in our organization had access to them. That's not a deal we ever would have made. And so, we were trying to get them like everybody else, and we didn't. But when they became available, we went to work on them.
Well, I think this is a similar position. I wasn't personally involved in the talks that were going on in London, but I think there are similar issues going on in all the major news organisations, which is to what extent are you prepared to deal with any organisation about the access they'll give you and the demands they're putting on it. And I think our approach has been broadly similar to the Associated Press. As soon as it's out there, it's absolutely material for us to report on.
Sure.
You talked only about government secrecy. How about corporations? Arguably equally powerful in some respects, different laws, maybe different ethical questions regarding journalism?
Yeah, I just made a conscious decision to talk only about governments because the tools that governments have are different than what corporations have. But you're absolutely right. Governments do have obligations. Corporations do have obligations. They're not guided by laws. Generally, they're guided by guidelines, but the issues are just the same. However, we haven't been jailed or beaten by any corporate entities recently, which is why I chose to stick with governments.
You said that you didn't get the documents because. Can you tell us why you didn't get them and what were the kinds of do you know what kind of deal the New York Times and others had to make in order to get them?
You've got Bill Keller here at noon. That's a great question for him. And I know Bill, and he would, and I wouldn't want anybody to understand me to say that I think anybody else made a deal that was repugnant. But I'm just describing what was proffered to us and what was acceptable to us. So.
What other kinds of things what other kinds of things would you have had to have agreed to?
But we didn't. We wouldn't have.
You didn't get them?
I don't know that that's the reason we didn't get them. We made it clear we wouldn't make those agreements. I think there is also a, Julian Assange is an advocate. And those of you who are journalists understand what it's like to deal with advocates. They're advocating for a certain point of view. One of the challenges that the AP has sometimes is that because we are a U.S.-based organization, we're a global organization, we have a good chunk of revenue and customers around the world and staff there, but we are very often shorthanded as an American organization, and it's possible that Mr. Assange thought that we were tainted by that in some way. But,
He didn't say?
We weren't talking directly.
Documents because?
No.
Okay.
No, he didn't say that.
Okay, someone else did.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask you about the future of sources and the concept of sources and how you think the new media might affect the approach to cultivating sources and then the material that those sources would submit, especially given how WikiLeaks has made a big point about the nature of validating material that's submitted by sources who remain in principle anonymous, and whether you think that the human factor in the traditional press will remain a more important aspect of all of that.
Oh, sure. Source reporting is always, and sources tip you off to where to look for documents or what to look for, or they give you information, or they were in the room when the decision was made and you talk to them. I mean, not everybody's keeping nice little anal records that can be searched in a database. Yeah, humans, you know. Look, sitting at a computer, pawing through documents and, you know, working the phone is not going to be the only way forward. It is a tool like getting out off your fanny and going out and looking at stuff, you know. And human sources are always going to be extremely valuable. So, sorry.
Following up on sources, would you agree that the major damage to the State Department is their sources might not talk to them anymore? If Sally King doesn't feel that he can speak privately, he's not going to speak anymore. And if you agree that is the most important damage, what if WikiLeaks were to reveal all our sources that we've promised confidentiality to? Supposing there was a WikiLeaks who could have told early on, released who Deep Throat was. Maybe the Washington Post would never have been able to break the Watergate.
I won't follow you out all of those windows. I will say that most people in diplomacy, sweeping statement, would tell you that diplomats and the people who are involved in diplomacy in capitals around the world generally knew the things that were in those cables. I mean, it was exposing to a wider audience a lot of things that people know about how diplomacy gets done. You know, the damage to that, whether the king decides to talk or not, I think will depend on what other motivation the king has for talking. I think it's going to be way too early to make proclamations about sweeping damage at this point. Thank you all very much. It's been